In the heart of the Middle East, there's a city that belongs not only to the present, nor only to one people. Jerusalem is the spiritual center for over half of humanity. For Jews, it's the home of the Temple of Solomon. For Christians, it's the stage of the crucifixion and resurrection. For Muslims, it's where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heavens. 3 religions, 1 city, and a dispute that has never ended. While other capitals serve politics, Jerusalem serves eternity. Every stone, every narrow street, every prayer murmured within its walls echoes centuries of faith and conflict. The same walls that house prayers also guard secrets, blood and promises made by different gods to peoples who cross paths without truly seeing each other. But what many ignore is that no territorial division can erase Jerusalem's symbolism, because whoever controls Jerusalem doesn't just govern a piece of land, they govern the sacred imagination of billions. That's why it's more dangerous than oil, more powerful than gold, and more explosive than any bomb. In this video we'll reveal why Jerusalem is sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, how this dispute formed over the centuries, and why it could still ignite the next war. If you want to understand why this city continues to divide heavens, prayers, and soldiers, welcome to Sand and Blood. Before Jerusalem was a city of walls and flags, it was just a hill, a mound surrounded by dust, silence, and eternity. And it was there, according to the 3 great monotheistic religions, that a man looked up to the sky and heard a voice. This man was Abraham, or Ibrahim, as Muslims call him. For Jews, he is the father of the nation of Israel. For Christians, the first patriarch of faith. For Muslims, the example of total submission to God, 3 traditions, 1 same beginning. But this is where the first crack appears, not about who Abraham was, but about who inherited his promise. The Hebrew Bible states that God promised Abraham and his descendants, through Isaac, the land of Canaan, which includes Jerusalem. The Quran, however, recognizes Abraham as a prophet, but considers Ishmael, not Isaac, the son of the promise. Ishmael, the spiritual father of the Arab peoples. From there the timeline branches. 2 sacred genealogies, 2 spiritual maps, 1 same territory. But why Jerusalem? Because according to Jewish tradition, it was there, on Mount Moriah, that Abraham was called by God to sacrifice his son, a test of faith, an almost blind obedience, and an angel who stops the blade at the last second. This place would later become where Solomon erected the first temple, where today the esplanade of mosques stands. For Muslims, this same hill is called Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. It is the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, where the Prophet Muhammad, on his night journey, is said to have ascended to the heavens guided by the angel Gabriel. And Christians? For them, Jerusalem is where Christ was crucified and resurrected. The soil where the sacred became flesh, where the cross divided history, and where the promise of redemption echoed to the ends of the Roman Empire. Thus, Jerusalem came to represent not just faith, but existential identity, not just a symbol, but the center of each people's narrative. The undividable promise. And here's the problem: a promise cannot be divided. For Jews, Jerusalem is the eternal center of faith, the capital given by God. For Muslims, it is the 3rd holiest place in Islam, after Mecca and Medina. For Christians, it is the site of martyrdom and resurrection, the soil that witnessed the incarnation of the divine. 3 monotheistic religions, 3 exclusive visions of truth, 3 interpretations of the same promise, and none of them are willing to give up. Over time, Jerusalem has been conquered, destroyed, rebuilt, desecrated, and redeemed. But one thing has never changed: it has never belonged only to the living, because those who die for it believe they are fighting for something greater than life itself. That is why any attempt to divide it always fails. Because Jerusalem cannot be cut into 3 without the veins of each faith bleeding in protest. What began with a promise between Abraham and heaven descended to earth as a dispute that has lasted millennia, and it is still far from over. In the heart of Jerusalem, 3 structures face each other, not with weapons, but with meaning. What separates these buildings is not just stone or architecture, but the weight of the narratives they carry, Each is a monument to a faith. But together, they form a magnetic field of spiritual tension that attracts millions and threatens to explode at any moment. There stands what remains of Solomon's Temple, the Western Wall, where Jews press their foreheads against the ancient stone and whisper prayers. There, according to the Tanakh, once stood the Ark of the Covenant. There sacrifices were performed. There the presence of God dwelled, and even after 2 destructions, one by the Babylonians, another by the Romans, the site remains the holiest in Judaism. But this very same place, the Temple Mount, is today called Haram al-Sharif by Muslims. And it is there that 2 of Islam's most important structures rise: the Dome of the Rock, with its golden dome visible from all of Jerusalem, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the point of Muhammad's celestial ascension, according to Islamic tradition. Between these 2 realities, there is no physical space for reconciliation, the same soil, the same stones, but with overlapping layers of faith, history, and rivalry. Each structure asserts a spiritual presence that denies the other. Every brick is an argument, every prayer, a claim. And where are the Christians in this landscape? They are at the Holy Sepulchre, a church built over the traditional site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. There the faithful line up to touch the stone where the body is said to have been anointed. There pilgrims from all over the world kneel, weep, light candles. For Christianity, that is not just a place, it is the center of the miracle of salvation. And even this church, so sacred to so many, is a stage for internal disputes. Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Armenians, Copts, and Ethiopians divide the administration of the temple in a delicate liturgical choreography, marked by ancient rivalries. A forgotten ladder on a church balcony, left there in the 18th century, has never been moved. By agreement, out of fear, by tradition, the ladder became a symbol that no faith wants to concede even an inch. This is Jerusalem, a place where the sacred overlaps, but does not merge, and every attempt at excavation, renovation, or restoration can be interpreted as an attack. Because here, moving a stone is not a technical act, it is a declaration of theological war, and so the Temple Mount remains suspended in time. The Jewish temple was destroyed, but its absence still dominates Israel's spiritual landscape. The Dome of the Rock shines, but its foundation rests on the rubble of another faith. The cross rises in the bells of the Holy Sepulchre, but it doesn't dominate the skies, it only echoes between the minarets and the walls. In Jerusalem, there is no neutral ground. Every building is a reminder of loss, a promise of return, or a silent warning that no peace will be lasting if it tries to ignore what is buried beneath the foundations of faith. And perhaps that is why this city, so small in area, is so immense in consequence, because where the sacred overlaps, conflict infiltrates, and where faith is non-negotiable, peace becomes impossible without wounds. As sacred as Jerusalem was to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, a time came when prayer gave way to the sword. The holy city, once sought by the faithful as a spiritual refuge, became the most coveted battlefield in the medieval world, because whoever controlled Jerusalem didn't just dominate stones, they dominated prophecies. In the year 638, Caliph Omar entered Jerusalem peacefully. The Byzantines ceded the city without bloodshed, and there, the Muslims established control of the Haram al-Sharif, respecting Christian sites, maintaining some coexistence among the religions. During this period, many Christians continued pilgrimages and Jews returned on a small scale. But history would change course with the echo of a call from Europe. In 1095, Pope Urban II declared war. The First Crusade was launched with the goal of liberating the holy places from Muslim rule. But the cross guiding the armies brought not only faith, it brought vengeance, fanaticism, and a thirst for glory. In 1099, the Crusaders invaded Jerusalem. When they entered the city, they killed indiscriminately. Muslims were decapitated. Jews were burned alive inside synagogues. Even Eastern Christians were killed by mistake. It was more than a military conquest. It was a bloodbath in the name of heaven. Reports say that blood ran through the streets up to the ankles. The cross had returned, but its weight was made of bones. The Crusaders established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. They transformed mosques into churches. They appointed European kings to govern a land they barely knew. But the Muslims, wounded, never forgot. Decades later, a figure emerged who would become a symbol of Islamic resistance: Salah ad-Din, the Kurdish sultan known in the West as Saladin. In 1187, he defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin and marched on Jerusalem. But unlike the massacre of 1099, Saladin allowed Christians to leave the city safely. He restored to Jerusalem a dignity that war had buried. For a time, Muslims and Christians once again shared the city, but the cycle was far from over. New crusades came, new sieges, new broken treaties. The city changed hands repeatedly between crusaders, caliphates, and sultans. Each generation believed it would be the last to die for Jerusalem. But there was always more blood waiting. And what happened to the Jews during all this? They were expelled, then tolerated, then persecuted, then ignored. They were often the pariahs of a city that was also theirs. Every power that entered the holy city decided who had the right to live there, and the Jews almost always were forgotten. And yet, they never ceased to pray, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill." Thus the blood of crusaders, soldiers of Islam, and children of Israel was mixed on the same ground. The bones of conquerors piled up beneath the foundations of faith, and Jerusalem continued to stand, not as a symbol of peace, but as a witness that the sacred, when claimed by the sword, transforms into a curse. Because every time Jerusalem is taken by force, it becomes heavier, not because of its stones, but because of its memories. And these memories, etched in prophecies and sacred texts, still inflame hearts. They still mobilize armies. They still make the past fuel for the next battle. After centuries of conquests and reconquests, Jerusalem no longer belonged solely to sacred texts. It was now also the subject of treaties, UN resolutions, and maps drawn by secular hands. But there was a problem. How do you divide a city that's indivisible to all sides? In 1947, with the United Nations proposal for the partition of Palestine, Jerusalem was declared corpus separatum, a separate body under international administration, a diplomatic solution to a spiritual problem. But the plan never materialized. The 1948 war changed everything. Israel declared independence. Conflict erupted, and Jerusalem was split by war, not by negotiation. The western part stayed with Israel, the eastern part with Jordan, and what was meant to be an international city became a besieged city, by walls, gunfire, and resentment. During this period, Jews were forbidden from accessing the Western Wall. Cemeteries were desecrated. The synagogues in the Old City were destroyed or closed. Christians also faced restrictions, and Muslims saw Jordanian rule as insufficient for the spiritual grandeur that Haram al-Sharif represented. Then came 1967. During the Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem. Troops entered the Old City. Soldiers wept before the wall. For the first time in almost 2,000 years, Jews had political and military control over their most sacred site. For many, it was the fulfillment of a prophecy. For others, the beginning of a new wound. Since then, Israel declares Jerusalem as its eternal and indivisible capital. But the world doesn't unanimously accept this. The UN doesn't recognize full Israeli sovereignty over the city. Most embassies are in Tel Aviv. Palestinians claim East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state, and here lies the core of the problem. There isn't enough space for two absolute dreams within the same walls. For Israel, giving up the old city would be renouncing the soul of the nation. For Palestinians, accepting Jewish exclusivity means accepting that their history has been erased. For Christians, losing access to the holy sites would be the end of the faith's historical presence in the Holy Land. Many peace agreements have been attempted. Camp David, Oslo, Annapolis, each of them stumbled over the same stone: Jerusalem, always Jerusalem. How do you negotiate over the place where Muhammad ascended to the heavens? How do you seed the place where Jesus was crucified? How do you share the mount where Jews await the third temple? Every concession here sounds like betrayal. Every proposal seems profane. And in the midst of all this, a real population lives. Arab and Jewish, Christian, Muslim and secular. People who share buses, markets and streets, but don't share hopes. Because every child growing up in Jerusalem learns, from an early age, that an invisible wall separates souls, even when bodies walk side by side. The truth few want to face is that perhaps Jerusalem cannot be divided, because it was never truly united. What exists there isn't an ordinary city. It's a broken mirror, where each religion sees its own reflection, and rejects the other fragments. And every time someone tries to glue the pieces back together, the cut bleeds again. There are cities that die with time. Others are reborn from ruins. But Jerusalem never sleeps, never forgets, never surrenders to oblivion. It doesn't belong to common chronology. It exists as an open wound in time, a flame lit at the end of history's corridor. And perhaps that's why so many believe the end of the world will begin exactly there. For religious Jews, Jerusalem is the place where the third temple will be rebuilt after the arrival of the Messiah, a larger, eternal temple that will restore the glory of Israel and the divine presence on earth. But this temple, to exist, would need to be erected on the site where the Dome of the Rock stands today, which, for Islam, would make the act the greatest of sacrileges. For Shiite and Sunni Muslims, Jerusalem has a clear eschatological role. It is there that, according to some traditions, the Mahdi, the Islamic Redeemer, will appear to unite Muslims against evil, and by his side, Jesus will return, not as a Christian figure, but as a Muslim prophet, to destroy the false Messiah, the Dajjal. The holy city will be the stage for the final judgment. In Christianity, especially among more devout evangelicals and Catholics, Jerusalem is the place where Christ will return in glory, where nations will gather for Armageddon, where the dead will be resurrected, a place where history will fold in on itself, and time will be interrupted by eternity. 3 religions, 3 eschatological visions, 3 promises linked to the same point on the map. Now, stop and think, if a city is, at the same time, the center of prophecies for 3 billion people, what happens when it becomes the stage for modern warfare? When troops surround its neighborhoods? When radical groups claim it? When embassies are moved as provocations? When political leaders use it as a trump card? The answer is simple. It transforms into the epicenter of an explosion that is not merely military. It is spiritual. In 2020, when the U.S. transferred its embassy to Jerusalem, the gesture was interpreted by many as the fulfillment of a prophecy. For others, it was an insult. In seconds, peaceful streets turned into barricades, speeches turned into stones. The city reacted, as it always reacts. Jerusalem doesn't accept manipulation. It exacts a heavy price for every decision, because it carries the memory of martyrs, of kings, of prophets, because its stones know the taste of blood and the weight of promises. And in the current scenario, where Israel is surrounded by enemies, where Iran invokes the liberation of the city, where Hamas and Hezbollah declare holy war, where global powers use the region as a chessboard, the question that echoes among generals and theologians is one: what happens if Jerusalem is attacked at its heart? Not just an attack, not just a revolt, but an occupation, a siege, a direct attack on the dome, on the wall, on the holy sepulchre. This wouldn't just ignite political anger, but apocalyptic fury, because Jerusalem isn't just territory, it's a symbol, and symbols, when desecrated, don't just wound nations, they wound beliefs, they unleash crusades, they summon horses of the end times, and perhaps, deep down, everyone knows this. That's why there's so much fighting over it, because Jerusalem is the key of the past, of the present, and perhaps, of the end. Jerusalem isn't just a city, it's a sacred wound, a spiritual battlefield, and perhaps, the last domino of the ancient world before the new one begins. If you want to understand the history that maps don't show, and the risks that prophecies still hide, subscribe now to Sand and Blood. Because here wars aren't just for land, they're for eternity.